Welcome to Work This Way, a labor and employment podcast. I'm Tina Emerson, here today with Maynard Nexon labor and employment lawyer Jenny Cluverius. Good to see you, Jenny.
Always a pleasure, Tina.
Yes, and today we have got another episode with our friends Joan and Mim Munzel of the Arbor Consulting Group. They are a national human resources consulting firm specializing in HR risk management and regulatory affirmative action compliance. Joan and Mim have joined us before to talk about a wide array of compliance issues. Today we're going to talk about risk management around the construction industry. Joan and Mim, thanks for joining us again today.
Always happy to join
Happy to be here.
Well, can you first share how construction compliance is different from supply and service compliance for federal contractors and subcontractors?
Yes, they are very different, actually. They're treated differently by the agency. So you are either a construction company or a supply and service company, though the OFCCP is trying to blur that line a little bit, which we'll talk about later. So the regulations are different for women and minorities for construction companies. You don't have what many people might see as a more traditional affirmative action plan that supply and service companies would do. Instead, you have something called 16 specifications that you need to make sure you're doing and keeping track of. The other thing is that most of the audits of construction companies are on site. And involve the primary focus is on the trade employees. And so that's a little bit different, though that it is the same for both trade and salary when you get into the protected veterans and individual with disability plans. But they're treated differently. We've run into construction companies that weren't aware of that. And we're doing the more traditional affirmative action plans, not realizing they had this whole set of 16 specifications they had to comply with.
How are goals set for women and minorities on construction projects?
Yeah, it's really different. The government actually establishes the goals, so they're not calculated like they would be for a supply and service contractor. But the goals are all about the hours worked on construction projects by females and minorities. So you're keeping track. Most companies have the records, you just have to figure out how to extract them from the system. But that's what you're measuring is hours worked against these goals. And then in the audits, many times you have to produce your payroll records to prove that. So that's very, very different.
Do construction companies have to annually certify affirmative action plans like supply and service companies do?
That's another place where it's different. So for our viewers who may not realize, if you're a supply and service company, which is probably the majority of the federal contractors, you have to annually certify that you have compliant affirmative action plans through the OFCCP verification portal. Now, construction companies do not have to do that because, again, they don't have traditional women and minorities affirmative action plans. However, what they have to do is, and this is a rule that's not for supply and service companies so far, is for any subcontracts, if you're the prime contractor, for any subcontractors, contracts that are over $10,000, you need to notify the OFCCP district director for the location of that project that you have those. Now, this used to be quite a challenge because they could be all over the place. Many of these companies work in multiple states and everything. What the government has now done is put together a portal where you can go as a construction company and you can notify them through the portal that you have these subcontracts that are greater than $10,000. Now, I should warn you, one of the things they're going to be looking at is just make sure those subcontracts have women and minority subcontractors on them.
And Joan, just by way of follow-up question there, what happens in the event a construction contractor fails to go and do that?
Well, it's a violation, for sure. And it also means it's probably going to trigger potentially an audit. And it may also trigger the OFCCP looking deeper into all the various other requirements that you have. If you're kind of demonstrating you're not aware of your 16 specifications, and so they're going to think you're a good target, which you never want to be.
Absolutely not. All right, talk to us a little bit, if you can, about how audits for construction contractors are different or unique.
Yeah, as Joan mentioned, they're usually on site. Now, the pandemic did away with some of that, but we're seeing now the on site has come back. They audit by geography for construction. So they're going to look at your federal projects within a geography, but they also may look at your non-federal projects.
Yeah.
So that's really different. If you're doing business, if you're doing a lot of construction in a particular area, geographic area, all of those could potentially be audited. Excuse me. Both members of management on site as well as potentially trade employees may be interviewed during this process. And so, we like to let people know that ahead of time and kind of help them with what to expect with that. But that can be, it can be really nerve-wracking for folks if that's going on. It also can be a bit of a challenge. If the LCCP comes with a whole team and they're looking for a bunch of private offices to do interviews, we've had temporary doors be built and walls put up in a trailer.
Yeah, plywood put up.
Yeah.
People sit in their cars and do interviews.
Yeah. You kind of have to just make it work. So that's really different. They're going to check to be sure all your posters are up and, do your management people on site know what the goals are? Are they aware of equal employment opportunity and affirmative action? Just some real basic information. And then, like we talked about before, another difference, you may have to provide your certified payroll records in an audit like that.
Yeah. So we always go on site or, through a webinar or something and brief all the people that might be, interview the management level people to kind of make sure they are familiar with those different terms and they're not taken by surprise.
Yeah.
The other thing that can happen in an audit is for some reason in construction, they get surprise visits sometimes before they've even received an audit scheduling letter. I mean, it's kind of sneaky, to tell you the truth. But they're so used at construction sites for, EPA showing up and OSHA showing up and everything. And they think, well, this is just another one. But they are not allowed to come on site until you've received the audit scheduling letter and you've, schedule something appropriately. But we've had several construction audits where the auditors just show up and look around and ask questions. And if your leadership is not tuned in to that fact, they're like, oh yeah, come on in and let us tell you this stuff. So you really have to be careful about that in an audit.
And that's the exact point that I wanted to ask you about. I'm very interested in what advice do you have for our viewers who may have an auditor show up unannounced with them not having yet received the audit letter? What would you tell them to do in a situation like that?
Yeah, well, they have to, they can tell them they'll have to come back, they'll have to schedule something. You want to make sure that everybody at the site, the superintendents, the assistant superintendents, the foreman, the supervisors, whatever they're called, you want to make sure they're aware that they are not allowed to just show up. And even when they do show up, they are still your guest.
Yeah.
And if they have bad practices, which unfortunately sometimes they do, you can revoke their visitor privileges. But if they show up unannounced, then you have to say, no, you're going to have to contact Maynard Nexon or the Arbor Consulting Group and so on. And we have no letter. You don't have jurisdiction yet to show up and immediately call probably one of you guys to do that. But, they need to know better. That's the important thing. They just need to know they have some rights there.
And doing that preventative education in advance will help avoid a situation where they just throw the doors wide open.
Yeah.
And with all these differences that we've been talking about in the construction industry as opposed to other lines of business, what are some of the challenges that you've seen with construction compliance specifically?
Well, there have been some challenges, particularly this year from the OFCCP. Now, it always was in the past, I think, as I mentioned, you were fish or fowl, so to speak. You were a construction company or you were a supply and service company. You were not both. So if 51% of your work and everything that the company did was construction, you were construction. You got audited that way, you complied that way. If you were supply and service, again, you followed those regulations. Now they're trying to kind of blend the two together without the basis of, changing the regulations, for example. They're just putting these types of things in the FAQs, which have no force of law. And they're saying, well, if you have some engineering contracts or design contracts, a lot of times they're design and build are part of construction contracts, then we're going to audit you as a supply company. And, where's all your compliance with that? So, which makes no sense that you would have to comply with both the construction regulations and the supply and service regulations. And it hasn't been that way for decades. But we recently had a construction company. They even had construction in their title of the company that got a supply and service on it. And we were like, wait a minute here. Now we were able to beat it back, so to speak. But we had to go through a lot in order to do that. And it's creating a lot of problems. They're also trying to kind of change some of the definition of what's a trade employee. So a trade employee was, a laborer or skilled trades or so on. And now they're trying to include supervisors and superintendents and everything because they're incidental to construction. And again, you can't change the rules like by putting something in an FAQ. You really have to go through the whole Administrative Procedures Act and the policies and everything. So that's been a real challenge lately. We've had to make sort of some hybrid plans for some of our clients. So if they get hit with some of these, now both of these are being challenged, I might say right now, but they're still standing, they're still operating that way. So that's definitely a challenge.
When the OFCCP releases its audit list or annually, does it include construction contractors and supply and service contractors?
Well, they generally have two different lists. So they'll have a supply and service list and they'll have a construction list. And now we have to look at the supply and service list to see if our construction companies are on that. So we know we need to push back. Say, no, they're a construction company. You need to audit them that way.
That's fascinating. Well, what else is a challenge about construction compliance for federal contractors?
I think one of the hardest things is the culture change.
Yes.
So a lot of these construction companies started as family-owned businesses, or even to this day are family-owned businesses, even some larger construction companies. And, they've got a way of doing business and they've got their subcontractors that they like to deal with. And so they get a job and they call up, the drywallers that they like, and they bring them onto the site. Well, under the federal regulations, you have to open up that opportunity to more organizations and to more potential job seekers. So, you've got to list the job with the state. You've got to do the outreach. You've got to send out solicitations for bids to a larger and more diverse group of subcontractors. It's things like that are real culture changes, especially if you're used to operating a family-owned business.
Or the Friends and Family program.
Friends and Family program, that's right. Yeah. So I think, just kind of helping them understand, getting them in the program. What does it mean to be a federal contractor? What are the risks of that? How do you need to operate in order to manage risk? We do a lot of educating
Yes.
along the way with our construction clients.
And I have a question about just unique industries like this, where there are just nuances to the way you have to comply. What are some of the other industries that are similar to this, where you have an entire industry that's affected by other regulations that you have to have an outside professional look at to make sure that you're doing things properly?
Well, there are, for example, universities. Now, they don't have different sets of regulations, but they operate very differently. They do not operate like a manufacturing plant. And so it takes a lot to educate the auditor on how universities work or don't. There's a difference between faculty and staff. You've got all the different colleges and whatnot. They get kind of overwhelmed We had one auditor that said, well, I'm going to make sure I understand how universities work and everything they do and everything. And we thought, well, good luck with that. The person came on site 3 times and tried to interview people. And this audit was going on and on and on. And we finally had to talk to her supervisor and say, this is a bit much. It wasn't like she was finding violations, but she was trying to understand how a large, complex university worked. And I'm not sure anybody at the university totally knows that.
Yeah.
That,
Yeah. I think too, Joan, the other thing is we've got some clients who run really complex organizations.
yes.
And by that, I mean, in their affirmative action plan, you might have some really high level professionals, but you also might have people who are working in a call center and they all end up in one plan. And maybe it's even a functional affirmative action plan.
Yeah, which is different.
It is.
Yeah, different regulations.
Yeah. And so it's trying to explain those complexities in a simple way to a government auditor who just may not have that frame of reference. That is really challenging. It is a heavy lift in an audit when you have a client like that.
Or they know how government systems work, which you can imagine very bureaucratic. But we have some global consulting companies as clients where they have very high level employees, a matrix type of organization. They kind of can't handle that. I mean, we spend a great deal of our time in managing the audit, trying to translate to the OFCCP what our clients do and how that fits in, because they either have the model of government or they have a model of a manufacturing plant.
Right.
And that doesn't fit. That also doesn't fit in a lot of high-tech industries that are our clients, where they're doing, cybersecurity and different things. And it's a different world. But if you don't do that translation, then your client may lose out in an audit. So that's a big part of our job.
Well, while those regulations are the same, the way that it's applied is very nuanced. So we are glad to have consultants like you who do what you do. So thank you very much for educating us today. Thank you, Jenny, for being here. And thank you, Joan and Mim. We will see you next time on Work This Way.